So, let's introduce our panel. We've already seen some of them before, but can I first of all introduce Jos Delbeke, who's Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. You're very welcome, and of course you represent one of our hosts, and thank you for being here. Then someone you've seen a lot of, Princess Abze Djigma from Burkina Faso. Thank you very much for coming here, and I guess you're representing the practitioner side. Then we have the godfather himself, Ian Burton. And we also have Aile Jávo, who's president of the Saami Council. The Saami are a people that are right across the Nordic countries. Which country do you come from in particular?
Norway.
From Norway, thank you. And thank you for coming so beautifully dressed. And finally, Jos Delbeke, DG of Climate Action at the European, Christian Blondin, from WMO. So a range, and Christian, let's start with you. Give us your impressions and the outcomes and things that you will be taking away from this conference and that you will be putting into action.
Yes, thanks Viviane for giving me the floor, and thanks all of you to be here. I think it has been as far as I've been able to assess, because I just attended one day, it has been a wonderful conference, and I think we should commend the government of the Netherlands to organize and choose such a topic which matters to people, and especially to the young people, because that's where the future is in their hands. So I think it has been a very good mix of participants, whether coming from scientists, private sectors, other things. I think the choice of the topic is very relevant. I mean, I don't know of any basically human activity which is not climate sensitive or climate dependent, but food security, water management, disaster risk reduction, health, also all those topics, energy, of course, all those topics are climate sensitive. And also there are cross-cutting issues like risk assessment, adaptation planning, evaluation, governance. So I think everything has been touched upon, and in each of the workshops or sessions, I think some of the collective knowledge has been grabbed, and I think next steps have been identified. As far as WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, is concerned, I mean, one of the main tasks is to make sure that the science on climate is built on and is made available, accessible, known to everybody, and that decision makers, whoever they are, from the simple farmers to government of the most developed country, are aware of what is the challenge and what may be the options. And especially as a father with UNEP of the IPCC, we are very much committed to make all these things policy relevant, though we cannot be obviously policy prescriptive, as we used to say. From our perspective, what with WMO we have been doing, recognizing that this is something that no one can do alone, is to build the partnerships, including with obviously the European Commission, through what we have called the Global Framework for Climate Services, which meant to make this climate information available, accessible, and used. And I think one of the challenges that we have is to educate the end users of using for the better the climate science as it is available. And I've heard already that we should not wait for every scientific problem to be solved. There are uncertainties in the science, there are uncertainties in the model output, there are uncertainties in the scenario, but there is enough evidence that we should act now and without any delay. So my plea is that, and recognizing, for example, the effort of the Commission through Copernicus and the benefits that can come from the good cooperation with institutions like EC, but also my UN colleagues from different agencies, I hope that from this conference that everyone can bring back some hope, some idea of how to deal with things better, how to grips and find partners to advance its own agenda, and I'm very happy that this type of conference will be repeated itself in a short while, despite it may be a long time compared to the urgency of the action. So thanks again, everyone, for this wonderful experience and three days that are much better than 4 hours on Google, I can tell you.
Jos Delbeke, let's go straight to you from the European Commission side. What have you taken away, and what will be your actions? What do you see from the Commission's point of view needs to be done and should come out of this conference?
Well, in the European Commission, we have been investing a lot on climate action. We spend, on average, 20% of our budget related to climate change. I think that is a very important element, both on mitigation and increasingly on adaptation. Now, we recognize that one of the successes of the Paris Agreement is that we have global participation, but that we have to invest much more on adaptation along with mitigation. And so we are reinforcing our adaptation strategy and our actions on that. And to that extent, this conference has been very useful for us because, as everybody knows, when scarce resources have to be planned and used, you have to have a focus. And this meeting here, this 3 days well spent, where scientists, researchers, policymakers, all stakeholders were coming along, have let us focus on at least 2-3 areas on which we are going to invest a lot. The first is certainly cities, because that's going to be the reality of most of the people in the world that is going to have 7 billion people today, up to 10 billion by the mid of the century, and beyond that later. So mega cities are really going to be the reality of the day, not only in Europe, but also in the emerging economies and in the developing world. So cities is going to be one area. Another area is water. It was brought forward. This country has a particular expertise, but the way we use water and the way these 10 billion people are going to use water will have to be much more considered compared to anything we have been doing in the past. And our water consumption, also in this part of the world, will have to be revisited because there is simply not enough water for the 10 billion that is going to be on planet Earth. And the third element on which we are already paying a lot of attention to, but we are going to increase that, is disaster risk reduction. We have to have a look at the complete cycle. Prevention matters as much as recovery afterwards. So we will have to spend much more attention on this because we are going to be confronted with a world in which the climate is already changing. If we can limit it to 2 degrees Celsius, if we can limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's going to be heroic, by the way, but we will face up to a world that is already confronting climate change. So adaptation and the disasters that is going to be related to that will require a rethinking of what we are doing, not only in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. So these 3 essential topics are going to be revisited. We have lots of legislation. We have lots of budget lines. We have lots of things we can do. Also on the science, the research department is investing increasingly in questions related to mitigation, but also increasingly adaptation. So that is going to be the focus of what we are going to do in the coming years. I forgot to mention one important element, that is that development cooperation is going to be colored increasingly with the way we look at climate change, both on mitigation as well as on adaptation, because questions related to development aid cannot be dissociated from the reality of climate change, both on mitigation and on adaptation. So that is going to color our actions in the world, and it is really good to see that so many countries in the world are represented here and had a very good conference. So it brings me the message that we were sponsors of this conference, that this money was more than well spent. Thank you very much for your contributions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and it's been a very rich and rewarding set of sessions, so lots to take away, and a battle of hearts and minds still to be won, perhaps throughout Europe, but nevertheless a great start. So I want to come to our two representatives of two ends of communities that are going to be really affected. And I wanted to ask you, Áile, first of all, what have you taken away from this, and what will you be doing next as a result of this conference?
Well, I agree that it has been a very important conference, since it's bringing together so many different stakeholders, all with the same goal, to reduce or to fight climate change and to prepare ourselves to adapt to the changes that we all know are coming, but that we don't fully yet understand the consequences of. And from an indigenous people's perspective, we are contributing the least to climate change, but still we are among the first ones to be impacted by it. And I would also like to say that we, in fact, hold unique experience in adapting to changes, both socio-economic changes and environmental changes. And that adaptation mechanisms, they are, in fact, embedded in our traditional knowledge. And I'm very happy that the role of indigenous peoples and our traditional knowledge in climate change and adaptation process is slowly beginning to get recognized. The Paris Agreement, which the Minister mentioned earlier, from December last year, states that the rights of indigenous peoples should be respected when parties are taking action to address climate change. And also that adaptation action should be guided by the knowledge of indigenous peoples. And also in the very new EU policy for the Arctic, the EU clearly says that they stand ready to work together with indigenous peoples in the Arctic in order to develop an ambitious climate adaptation agenda for the Arctic region. And we're very happy for that, and we are looking forward to the next concrete steps being taken to implement those ambitions.
So very important, actually, to make a formal collection and repository of that knowledge. It's, if we don't collect that knowledge of those, critical adaptations, then we're losing a real resource.
Yes, I believe so. And also it's important for us from the Saami people, we expect that any measures taken to address climate change are not having adverse impacts on the Saami livelihoods, such as reindeer herding and coastal fisheries. And in any action, the Saami peoples have to be consulted and respected. And for instance, we experience that huge windmill parks are being planned and built in the middle of the reindeer herding pasture areas without any consultation or real dialogue with the reindeer herders involved. And together with the increased pressure from extractive industry, because you all know that everyone is saying that climate change brings new opportunities to the Arctic, and by that they mean resource extraction. This leads to a fragmentation of our pastures, and also they are blocking migration routes for the reindeers. And in times of climate change, we need more flexibility to alternative land use, and not less, in order to be able to adapt. And I believe the Saami Council, which I represent, is one of the permanent participants to the Arctic Council. And we believe that the Arctic Council can serve as a good model on how to structure a fruitful cooperation between states and indigenous peoples. And for those of you not familiar with the Arctic Council structure, it consists of 8 states and 6 so-called permanent participants, which are the indigenous peoples organizations in the region. And in the Arctic Council, and this is very unique from an indigenous perspective, states and indigenous peoples, we cooperate and participate as equal partners, and we sit around the same table at all levels, from the ministerial meetings to the working groups. And that, I think, is very important if we are talking about cooperation and respecting indigenous people.
So collaboration, important point that we've had stressed time and time again. Princess, you are nodding madly because I know that this is, this is exactly what you have been saying several times during this event.
Not the same color, but the same way of living. You said something that is, we are sustainable by nature. We don't build our family, but we continue our family. We build our society on trust. Without trust, you don't get anywhere. Again, I said that at the beginning of the session, but it's the case. Of course, in my case, for least developing countries and small islands, our developing countries, landlocked developing countries, because I'm landlocked. I will tell you why I'm saying that. Because when you live in the landlocked developing country, in terms of transportation, what you buy when you live at the coast is more expensive. And also, in terms of drought, you suffered more. Climate change, we are the first impacted. And in terms of business, it's very difficult. That's why I'm organizing our people who are selling their goods alongside the road, which is more women and youth who are in the surviving mode. But they're underestimated and under-recognized in our society. The policy is not taking them serious, but they're representing the economic growth. They are the drivers. And I'm happy to hear that the European Commission will consider in budgetizing us. Really my great profound gratitude on that. But what I would like you to do is to invest in programs. Stop investing in pilots. You know, my parents, they sent me to school. The international community helped us to send the girls at school. I'm the result. I'm engineer now. That means that you succeed, right? But why you don't trust me studying in your schools to implement? I think that it's time to also make use of that brains who's in developing country and developed world, and create a channel to allow them to help the bottom of the pyramid people. I think if we have the means, the sky will be the limit. And I think that we also have our homework to do. We can't say, being in the complaining mode, that's what I'm telling to my people, we need to structure ourselves. What I did is to put in place the expertise hub for the informal sector. I said that it will be much more easier for the foreign and direct investment to trust us and come in an enabling environment. That's my role with what I've learned from the other world, and to link it with my values. The values is that we together decide as with the Saami. The together is important. And I think why you create the European Union? To be stronger together. Alone, you don't get anywhere. Often our wisdom I use in international commission. But that is the practitioners, the bottom-up, a top-down approach need to come up together. And what was missing is in the between. And I think we, the practitioners, you need to put us in the center.
Okay, so you're meeting in the middle there. Let me come to you now, Ian, because the ultimate scientist in this field, what have you made of all of this? That good, eh? He's preparing himself.
Well, first of all, I would like to make a correction about that title that somebody was imposing on me of Godfather. I don't want to be associated with that word. Some of you may know that it has other rather negative connotations.
I didn't want to call you grandfather.
Well, I would much prefer you to call me grandfather, actually.
Lord Grandfather of Burton.
I am not the grandfather, I am a grandfather. I had many, many colleagues who helped in the generation this, this idea, this scheme, this movement, if I may call it that. And what am I going to take away? I think I'm going to take away a greatly enhanced and expanded view of who we are, who we were, where we have come from, and in particular, where I think we are going, or where I hope we are going. And some of the things I'm going to say I know will not find favor with everybody in the audience, because I've tried them out over the coffee breaks. And,
be warned.
And
brace yourselves.
They didn't always go down very well. So who we are, I think, has been said many times. It was said in the opening session. But I would just add to that a sense of being a movement, a collection of people who are really have a mission in hand and are going somewhere. And while we are, somebody said, la crème de la crème, but we actually represent a very, very large number of people around the world that, without having much of a clue about what is going on internationally, are nevertheless taking account of evidence of climate change in their own places, in their own communities, and beginning to think and find out and do and use their own experience and knowledge to bring to bear on it. So we're an important set of people, but there are a lot more already there. Where did we come from? I find it astonishing that when Richard Klein and Salim Hook and one or two other people were the authors of the first adaptation chapter in the third IPCC report in 2001, there were probably 6 or 7 people who wrote the chapter, and you could identify in the scholarly world perhaps 100 other people who were working in this area. And if you looked at the literature, there were a few hundred references at most. What has grown in the last 15 years or so is, to me, just totally astonishing, which reflects to me an enormous realization of the threat of climate change, and a realization that on the mitigation side, although that was initially branded as the solution, that's what the problem was all about, was mitigation. And it's been a slow climb to get adaptation up there to the top of the list together with mitigation. There's been some progress in how we think about it. I think originally adaptation was thought of in a very, very incremental way. We do a little bit of this here and a little bit of that there. It was basically incremental adaptation. And we've seen a lot of that being reported and talked about at this conference. And it's very good and it's very important, and I don't in any means have any adverse comment to make about that. We need a lot more of it. But by itself, it's not sufficient. And the realization came about that we need to think about adaptation in a more systemic way. So it's not just changing this crop or this water use. It's thinking about agriculture. It's thinking about food supplies. It's thinking about migration. It's thinking about this in much larger terms. And we've now come to talk about that, some people in the literature, about the idea of transformative adaptation. So far, so good. So now I come to the question of my imagination that says, where are we going? And I think that we are moving, I know not everybody agrees, in a more critical and radical, I would almost say, revolutionary direction. We are part of it. We're not the only players by any means. But somebody said earlier, let's think not just about adaptation, but about the global context in which we're trying to push forward adaptation. And need I remind you that in the global context, things are not quite so happy. That since 2008, the world economy, to mention one part of it, has not really been doing very well. We have, to my way of thinking, a relative weakness of government and a weakness of institutional legal systems in relation to the magnitude of the problems that we face. We have a rather dominance of economic values in the global paradigm over social and environmental values. We live in a world where laissez-faire is promoted as an ideal, where we are going about deregulation, privatization, and saying there are market solutions. Well, there are market solutions, but market solutions not to everything. So I think I would like us to reflect a little bit about that and say, how do we work with adaptation in this kind of a world? Sure, we need to engage the private sector. Surely the private sector has a big role to play. Certainly there is corporate responsibility. Certainly there are corporate opportunities. But we need to think a little more critically about this. I believe there are great reasons for optimism. I am an optimism. I think we can get through this problem before we come to the next one. But we have the Paris Agreement, we have the SDGs. There are lots of reasons to be optimistic. But if I would want to put in a note of realism, and it's not pessimism, if I wanted to put in a note of realism, I would to say that we are in danger of just focusing in our own silo about vulnerability reduction, about exposure reduction, about risk reduction. And heaven knows we're doing that, and the organizations that are represented here speak very articulately about how they're doing that. But they don't represent the whole of the global economy, and they don't represent entirely where the world is going. I think that in some areas, we're busily, quietly going around creating risks, and creating risks perhaps at a faster rate than we are in fact reducing them. So I think we need to continue to adapt incrementally, systematically, in a transformational way. But I think we need to also think in a more radical way about how the global economy, the way it is developing and the way it is being managed, and not just the economy, now is in danger of creating as many risks as it reduces. So I think that part of the way to ponder that is to think about, why are we adapting? Why are we so concerned to increase our gross domestic product in areas that already have a very high gross domestic product? Perhaps we should think a little bit more about purpose. Perhaps we should think a little bit more about meaning. What is the meaning of economic development? And what is the meaning of adaptation? And what it is that we're trying to achieve? Well, some person mentioned Bhutan and said, isn't it happiness? I don't think so. I belong to the school of thought that says you only find happiness when you've stopped searching for it. So I would like to leave you with those reflective, not pessimistic, but an appeal for all the joy and enthusiasm which certainly comes out of this meeting and which I share, with a little touch of realism. Thank you.
And let's just have a quick reflection on that from you, because we are in extraordinarily difficult economic times.
Yes, we are. And the EU is, when we look at our part of the world, we are not in good shape. I think we can say that. But at the same time, I think we have to develop policies with the view on the long term, but have policies with a realistic time frame. And that is what we try to do in the EU when it comes to climate change and all the dimensions of it. We have defined 2030 as the point to optimize the thoughts of the people, because we are living in a democracy. So we have to have actions endorsed by qualified majorities in our system. And that's a lot. So once you come with an idea, you have to operationalize that idea. And we were sticking out 2030 because that's far enough off the day-to-day attention of the people, but it's not too far off so that it would no longer focus the minds of the people. So that's why 2030 has been the focus of our mitigation action, and is also going to be the focus of our adaptation action. And such a conference as this one is very useful to have the period and the vision beyond 2030, so that we are not making mistakes in defining the precise targets for 2030, but that we have a vision on where we have to go in a longer time frame. And I think that is where we have to develop operational plans as policymakers for an operational time frame. But a conference like this frames that in a vision that is much more varied and much more rich compared to what we as policymakers in our offices and in our voting systems can do. But again, we try to develop in the European Union at least a vision so that we can have a mature discussion, not only what we have to do ourselves, but also having a good debate with our partners in the rest of the world. And the Paris Agreement, for that reason, was a real achievement, because for the first time ever, we got into a global conversation. We have 98% of the emissions and the world population covered, which is, I think, unique in the proceedings of the United Nations. And that is where I think this conference is filling up that part on which we will have to make the first step in Marrakesh, and then after, you know, the next steps that still are needed to be developed.
Christian Blondin, you've been involved in this field. The WMO is just, has been so instrumental in all of this. Have we reached the moment that adaptation has finally come into its own? Is this the tipping point for adaptation, do you think? When finally it's moved into the limelight, I mean, Ian highlighted how explosive the activity in research has been in this area. Is this the moment, finally, it's come into the limelight and its time is now?
What I can say is that well, the time is always now, but it has been for quite a while in WMO context. I mean, when I just have to remember perhaps the audience that why we are here, especially through the UNFCCC and IPCC, has come from World Climate Conference organized by the World Meteorological Organization. And so from our side, mitigation is not really what we can bring a lot to, but adaptation was from the very start things that we WMO with National Weather and Hydrological Meteorological Services in your country try to bring to the citizens, means to adapt, means to avoid extreme to turn into disaster, because as was said, prevention is preparedness is essential. And if you look at the variation in time in the last decades of casualties or loss of economic assets, you will see that there is a sharp decrease in the casualties, while there is hopefully a huge increase in economic loss. And this is due of the fact that two things. First, early warning system has been developed, thanks to a lot of investment, and I insist on this word, it's investment, it's not just cost, because from this investment you bring a lot to your citizens and to the communities and to the societies, but unfortunately the increase in the economic loss is due to the fact that a lot of the development because of demography and other things has been occurring in vulnerable zones like coastal and cities exposed to extremes. So we, as a WMO, we are part of this history from yesterday, and we will be still tomorrow. And I guess that what I would like to keep from what has been said, first of all, we are all in a global, universal, integrated, and transformative agenda. Paris Agreement is just one bit. If you look at the Samoa Pathway, the Sendai Framework, the SDGs, the Coming World Humanitarian Summit, Habitat 3, just to name few. So now the challenge is implementation. We know, at least in the UN system, we have been willing to be UN as one for quite a while, and I think we have to achieve this now. But also at government, at local level, acting as one is absolutely essential. And from what, Princess, you said, I think we have to have absolutely both ends meet. And what I mean by that is that we know that you have to think global, but we have to act local. And WMO in this respect is trying to bring communities where the knowledge, the science has been developed, and often but not only, and it's not only in the developed world, a lot of knowledge has been grabbed in Africa and other countries, but we have to have the practitioners, the ones who are the doers at local level, benefited from this global knowledge. And this is what we are modestly and humbly trying to do. Everybody is able, hopefully, in his own country, to assess the increased value of the weather forecast. That has been really quite I think, unique development in the human science and history. A lot of people now are very much and better prepared to cope with weather conditions. We still need to have a lot to educate the practitioners, the farmers, the planners, and everything to use this information. We have to educate the youth. We have to make sure that they have the capacity and the knowledge to be the leaders of tomorrow. But I think from this conference, I bring a lot of hope. I'm also a grandfather, and I'm happy to share with my colleague here that obviously for our grandkids, obviously what we see today is a lot of awareness, but a lack of really putting things into concrete action in the field.
Well, a lot of wisdom from the panel, whatever their age, wherever they were from, whether they were policymakers, whether they were practitioners, a lot about the wisdom. And from an outsider's point of view, I think the time for adaptation has really come. I think it's an extraordinary moment.